And good afternoon. Charles Moscowitz here. Steve Turley is my guest of this segment. Steve is internationally recognized scholar, speaker, and classical guitarist. He is a professor in theology, Greek, and rhetoric. Steve, thanks for joining me.
Well, it's my pleasure, Charles. Thank you for having me.
And Steve, you certainly have a gangbuster of a YouTube channel going. I've been watching it. Very, very good.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Now, you bring up a very interesting premise in that you seem to believe that we are entering into a, you might say, renaissance of Western Judeo-Christian culture in the United States and maybe around the world. And I think you peg that to not to the pandemic itself, but that the pandemic is an opportunity to advance such culture. So talk a little bit, if you will, about your premise there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Charles. So what I saw prior to the pandemic were a number of dynamics that scholars tend to call post-security politics. It's a very interesting term. The nation state that's got structured, not to get too nerdy, but the nation state that got structured around the 17th century, that really in many respects, like Yoram Hazony, the Israeli scholar, argues, was more or less modeled after sort of a biblical cartography, so the Israelites, the Hittites, the Canaanites, the Egyptians. Well, prior to the 17th century, in many respects, the world was kind of run by empires and imperial structures. And after sort of the fall of the Holy Roman Empire, we started breaking up into what we now know as the nation state. And there were three advantages to the nation state. We had a sense of border security, so we could stay safe from marauders, We had a sense of economic security, so we can find jobs and provide for our families. And we had a sense of cultural security, so that our religions, our customs, our traditions could be celebrated and revered and give our lives a sense of meaning so we can flourish as human beings. What globalism has done over, say, the last 4 decades or so, what scholars have noticed is it's smashed those three securities. It's opened up our borders into basically a borderless world. It's instituted what's known as an economic global division of labor, where manufacturing and industry has been shipped away from first world nations to so-called third world nations, China being the primary beneficiary of it. So we've lost all our manufacturing, and it tends to replace our customs, cultures, traditions with lifestyle values. Increasingly, proponents of globalism see our cultures, customs, traditions as hateful, as bigoted, as discriminatory, and the like. So, in the face of all that, there's been a massive backlash, and that backlash is going on all over the world, where populations are increasingly re-embracing their borders, their economic manufacturing base, and their cultures, customs, and traditions as mechanisms of resistance against globalization. And in many respects, this pandemic is only, well, in frankness, it's hastening both dynamics. It's hastening the craziness that we see with globalists and their autocratic tendencies, but it's also hastening and intensifying the blowback against that. Everybody now is closing their borders. Everybody wants to bring manufacturing back home and the like.
It seems to me that the portrayal of the idea of the nation state and national sovereignty involves a major case of psychological projection on the part of those who advocate globalism, because the nation state is a very progressive institution. It's one that evolved over thousands of years, and it's one that, as you say, it protects a culture, it protects property, it's natural to a nation to protect the life and the safety of its citizens and their futures. I mean, it goes back to the Bible, really, and when they began to develop national borders after mankind tried to overthrow God in heaven at the Tower of Babel. You developed different languages, different cultures, different nations, and then the Bible, the Torah, goes on to give very specific borders for the nations and for all of the individual tribes of Israel. So the whole concept emerged. It's not new, and it's something that has advanced, and I think the greatest advancement in the great progression of the nation state was the development of the United States.
Yeah.
in that we have, we are the first nation to really embrace the biblical idea that rights come from God and not from the state, that we're created in the image of God. We're not God. And that as such, we have a limited sovereignty that we derive from God. And then we give a state certain powers that protect and defend those rights. It's not, the state isn't the supreme, which is, of course, a biblical idea, but it's a radical idea. And it's an idea that was patented by the founding fathers of this republic. So, I think that the pandemic brings to fore the necessity for things like property. And now we're protecting our own private properties more from this dread disease that is banging at the door.
That's
The
right.
nation, exactly. And that the nation is protecting itself by limiting people coming into the country because they might have the disease. And I think that even the European Union, which is very globalist, as you say, they've begun to protect their borders because that's what you do naturally. I mean, the animal kingdom understands this. A bird understands this. Try to interfere with the bird's nest and see what happens. Dogs understand it. Go too close to a dog and see what happens. The idea of the nation state or the idea of the individual property is a natural thing. It's kind of hardwired into us, and this movement to erase it and to try to claim that it's anachronistic or something is actually an unnatural development.
In many respects, what we're seeing now is simply a deference to the very nationalist, populist, America First policies that Trump had been implementing for the past 3 years. If I told you, say 6 months ago, that a North American leader of a North American nation, whose last name starts with TRU, has closed all his borders, has instituted a travel ban from Europe, China, you name it, in an effort to seal those borders, you would be shocked that I told you that one would be a fellow by the name of Trudeau. But it's exactly what's happened. Even globalists are behaving like Pat Buchanan right now. Even globalists are adopting this nationalist populism, and the whole idea of the supply chain, of farming out our manufacturing for pharmaceuticals to China, that's dead. That ain't coming back anytime soon, that's for sure. Right. You have Macron in France talking about bringing back industry to France. Japan has done the same thing as well, as starting to bring back their industry away from China. They start to see it as all economic nationalists do. They see the economy as a national security issue. We are a nation with an economy. We're not an economy that happens to be a nation that bows to it all the time. That's the very globalistic structure. And it's stunning. They did a study even before the pandemic. Breitbart talked about it, and they found that over 70% of the American public, when you polled them and asked them pointed questions that were reflective of an America First nationalist populist agenda, 70% of Americans agreed with it. The biggest, the single most conservative demographic, racial demographic on border security are African Americans. They have one of the highest. Yeah, sorry, my phone is.
No, that's all right.
They have one of the highest rejections of immigration of any population, and of course because they're adversely affected by, especially illegal immigration with entry-level jobs.
Well, labor and minorities have always had an interest in reducing immigration because it cheapens the value of labor, and it cuts back on opportunities for minorities who are trying to get a place at the table, so to speak. Right. And I think that we can see from this situation that a nation state has the right to decide who enters the national home in the same way that you and I have a right to decide who enters our private home. It is a normal, natural thing. It's a good thing. You don't have to explain it. It's just one of the basic building blocks of any nation. I mean, you try to enter into a communist country. I mean, if you're not wanted. I mean, it's sort of, the left is now criticizing Trump because they say he didn't do enough in terms of stopping flights from China in the early stages of the pandemic. They're saying, oh, you still let people in. Well, hello, they were citizens And that
Yeah.
at the time, I remember they were screaming about the fact that, oh, he doesn't like Chinese men and women.
Right, right. It's
That's what's
called
motivating.
xenophobia. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's all very situational for them.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but the fact is that, it's just a normal, natural thing for any sovereign nation to do. These are the functions of sovereign nations. And I think it does certainly put globalism on its heels. The latest thing I'm hearing is that now, it's sort of a last-ditch, desperate attempt by the globalists that anyone who criticizes globalism, this is a euphemism for anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Hello, I happen to be Jewish, putting that aside, but as a Jew, I mean, Israel is a sovereign nation. I mean, the United States, I mean, this isn't an anti-Jewish thing. It's, are Jews supposed to be globalists? Some of them are, some of them aren't. But, this isn't something that is inherent in Jewish understanding at all. If anything, it's the nation state is the primary idea.
Exactly. And again, Yoram Hazony has been one of the major voices in that. A wonderful, wonderful scholar. He runs the National Conservative conferences. They just had theirs in Rome right before the pandemic. And of course, they had all those horrible anti-Semites like Viktor Orban and the like speaking there, as they're all, of course, laughing at such an assessment. Yeah, one of the funny things, there's some scholarship on this now, where they're finding that, in point of fact, people like Geert Wilders and a number of nationalist populists in Europe are extremely pro-Israel because they see the danger of Islam, and because Islam, in many respects, the Brazilian philosopher Olavo de Carvalho actually argues we have three globalisms going on right now. So the first globalism is the one we're all familiar with, the Western liberal globalism. That tends to be very economically driven. Then you have the Chinese globalism, which of course is Marxist driven, and that's getting hit hard as we speak. Thank God for that. But then you also have a religious globalism, which is the Islamic globalism, particularly via Iran and their expansionist tendencies. They want to take over the world. They haven't been able to figure out how to do it. But nevertheless, nationalist populists in Europe tend to recognize that. And they tend to see Israel as a beacon. And of course, Israel's probably, when all said and done, the most nationalist nation on the planet right now. In many respects, the commentators are saying the left doesn't even exist in Israel. The best they have is a center. The best is the white and blue party that just got formed. I mean, Likud is your consensus party, and then of course you have all the orthodox third parties, as it were. There's not even a left anymore, really, in Israel. So the nationalist populist right, particularly Trump, of course, have looked at Israel as actually inspiration in the midst of all this, especially as they're trying to fight their particular globalist enemy, which is militant Islam.
Right, and I think that Israel has always reached out an olive branch of peace to Arab and Islamic countries, saying, we're an example of a nation that has created our own sovereignty. We got rid of the British occupiers, and we want to urge you to do the same for your own respective nations. So, now you have Trump coming into office, and he's using some of the same rhetoric, of course, that was used by the Bushes and by Obama and Clinton, except he means it. And everyone knows that they didn't. They were full of it. They were just saying it for the bubbas, He talked about, protecting the borders, and he's doing it. He talked about better trade relations with foreign countries, and he's doing that. And economic relations that favor the United States and our labor and our industry, and he's doing that. So that, to me, is the thing that is leading the globalists to really take a very strong-fisted attempt to have him removed from office. And that includes several attempts at impeachment. I think there might be more coming down the pike. I mean, I pray for Trump. This is the enemies of Trump are the enemies of our sovereign nation right now. And I think we need to understand that. And I say the same thing to liberals who may not be aware of this, and even leftists who are not cognizant of it, because we all have a life in this country. We all have a family and we want to have a future. And do we want to have that future under our own? I mean, sovereign nations, that's democratic.
Right.
That means that you as
Right.
an individual, as in a community, have more say and more control over your own life and
Of
destiny,
course.
not some foreign, unelected, faceless bureaucracy that's either in the form of an international form of governance or an international corporate form of governance. It doesn't matter. The point is that they have to be held accountable by a constitution and by elected officials who we elect to represent our interests.
It's so interesting because even Bill Maher, an ultra leftist like Bill Maher, recognizes that if you actually want to have a conversation, a deep, meaningful political conversation, cultural conversation, you have to go to the right. The left is almost, it seems, incapable of doing that today, particularly the media, the mainstream, I like to call Marxist media. If you want to have a reasonable conversation, John Stossel found this out, Stossel being very libertarian. So being a libertarian, he's very liberal in many things, also conservative in others. He found liberals shocked and absolutely offended by the things he was saying, whereas conservatives are like, oh, that's interesting. Let's chat about that. That's why we have the talk radio everywhere. I mean, talk radio is by definition 99% conservative because we love reading and thinking and reflecting and then conversio, having a conversation. Because we're not afraid. We have a sense that there's truth out there. We're all trying to get to it. And we're confident that we feel a certain sense that we're really pretty close to it here. And when you have an entire political movement that says no, and anything to the right of us is by definition taboo. It's by definition now going to be defined as hateful, bigoted, homophobic, anti-Semitic, xenophobic, and on. And therefore, it's to be dismissed, rejected, and excommunicated. The cancel culture. How is that even remotely democratic? How is that not the very authoritarianism they try to denounce us for? We're the ones who want democracy. We're the ones that want referendums. We are the ones who want more say over what happens in our nation. And we want to do it through conversation and a normal democratic discourse. So it's crazy, but that's why we get to have these great conversations.
That's right. I mean, it's a major case, again, of projection because the left is very solitary and conformist in its views. Their arguments have more to do with degrees of how fast they want to go or personality disputes, but not on ideology. I mean, the ideology, whether they're conscious of it or not, tends to be the same. Their hatred for Trump is that he's actually challenging that view. And the hatred in the media, and you talk about this on your YouTube channel, Steve, and you do so quite eloquently, it is really unprecedented. It's really open to the point where they really are no longer professional. I mean, they'll do a story based upon one anonymous source, which is unthinkable before Trump. And then, of course, the next day when it's disproved, they then take it down and go on to the next one. And it's just this constant barrage. I mean, and the hatred is so palpable. I mean, I was listening to Michael Smerconish, who's a big-time left-of-center radio talk show host in Philadelphia. He's been there for about 30 years. And early in the administration, when the atmosphere was almost like Frankensteinian, I mean, people were showing up with torches and the rage was just on the street. He made one mild comment that praised President Trump about something he had done. And it wasn't even a big deal. It was some technical thing. And he says, we have to give a little credit. And then he got such hate mail and people were going to boycott his sponsors. I mean, people that had been sponsoring him for 20 years. And it was so bad that he had to back down and he had almost like retracted. The atmosphere is like, it's like a carnival. And I think that it might have lessened a little bit because a lot of people, I mean, the average person who dislikes Trump is not like that. They have legitimate complaints. I get that. Or they don't like his personality. That's fine. But this derangement is something that I think what they're weighing and balancing now is how far do they want to go with that? Because if they expose it any further, it's going to sink them. So, what do you see happening with the upcoming election? I mean, I'm actually very concerned, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the forces that are arrayed against Trump. I mean, these people aren't going to take no for an answer.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's I think the way to situate the election, at least the way I'm doing it, is to have a healthy balance between recognizing we are in uncharted territory right now, especially with this pandemic, and we're going to have to see the economic fallout from it over the next few months. So we're going to have to see what's going on there, but also to look at it in terms of the patterns that have been pretty prevalent, certainly over the last 100 years of presidential elections. Now, for that, I tend to be very impressed with what's called the primary model by Helmut Norpoth of the University of Stony Brook, because it's an algorithm that has studied elections since 1912, which is the first year that the candidates had to go through a primary. And what he found is he found a pattern. The pattern he found is that the primary is the election in microcosm. So you look at the candidate who wins the most votes, particularly in the early primaries, you plug that data in to this algorithm, and then out comes the algorithm's determined winner. And he found it lined up with every single winner all the way up to 2016.
Wow.
I think there was one exception. I forget where that was, but that was the pattern. That's your ultimate poll, right? Your poll numbers. Who tends to win those elections? Who tends to win those elections are usually the incumbent. It's a twofold pattern. It's usually the incumbent. So if you've had the same party in power for two administrations, 9 times out of 10, we go to another party. We swing back and forth. Certainly since FDR and Truman, we've been doing that pendulum swing pretty consistently. Jimmy Carter was the one interruption with that. He had one term, and
also Bush Sr.
Well, Bush so what he says is Bush Sr. technically is the third term of Reagan.
Oh, okay.
So Bush Sr. getting voted in was the disruption of it. That's the interesting thing. So you had 12 years of a Republican administration there. So you almost had a little bit of a going back to the FDR Truman era to a certain extent. So Trump had that going for him. And then when he ran the numbers for the primary, Trump is setting records in terms of voting turnout in Iowa, in the caucus, in New Hampshire. He got 3 times the amount that Obama got the last time an incumbent was running for re-election, 2012. So he ran the numbers for Biden versus Trump in terms of the primaries. And he gives, based on that, plus with the pendulum swing, he gives Trump a 91% chance of winning re-election. Now, he is saying this is unprecedented territory, but if it plays out the way it's been playing out for the last 100 years, we should see Trump in a blowout. We'll have to see. So I know what you mean. I'm with you 1,000%. I'm scared too. There's just so much going against him and everything like that. But Norpoth is standing by his prediction, and he was right in 2016. Yeah.
Did he do this before the pandemic?
So he did it before the pandemic, and then if you go to the website, primarymodel.com, he has a caution on there. He says, now that we had this outbreak, I'm going to be watching to see if there's a massive disruption in Trump's poll numbers. If he goes down to 15%, he'll probably say, all right, forget it. My primary model isn't going to be applicable to this anymore. So he's been watching the poll numbers. And of course, I mean, his polls go up and down, but of course, the Gallup polls have been pretty impressive. Trump has positioned himself as a wartime president, and his support among Republicans has remained absolutely solid. So his support among independents is around that 50%, 60% mark. So he seems to be doing, so Helmut Norpoth has since said, the one thing he said is the last thing we got to watch out for is just the economic data that comes out this summer. If we're going into this election with 20% unemployment, all bets are off. But if he can bring that back down, we can open up the country again, which you've noticed blue states don't want to do, interestingly
Right.
enough.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think they know it's going to really hinge on that.
Well, it's all very unknown because the situation is so unprecedented, and I guess the question is, are they going to be able to hang blame for this on Trump? Are they going to parrot the communist Chinese line and do that? I think that in my opinion, we should be grateful, and I pray to God that Trump's president during this thing, because if we had the liberals and the left in office, we'd probably have concentration camps right now for people who step off the lawn.
I can't even imagine.
Take a look at some of these states. I mean, like Oregon is now, moving the opening date up to August 1st. I mean, it's and they only have like a couple of hundred cases, so it's not. It does show the authoritarian nature here, and we could go through other states. My own state of Massachusetts actually has been somewhat moderate so far.
Okay,
I guess maybe because we have a Republican governor. I don't know, but it's not as bad as Michigan or as some of these other states where they're arresting people for going to church. So, I think that all of it, however, remains to be seen. I think that I don't want to sound too tin hat here, but I wonder if they're trying to damage the economy as a way to stop Trump. I mean, I know that sounds far-fetched, but given the lowness of this, I mean, impeaching him and doing all these other things, and all these, frankly, these conspiracies, I wouldn't put it past them. I mean, I just, my way of thinking, I mean, they'll do anything. So, because we're not talking just about Donald Trump. We're talking about, as we started, Steve, a global movement that is, of which people are beginning to wake up. They're getting really woke, to use the term.
In a good way, right?
Yeah, in the real sense. And they're realizing that they want a government that protects their rights, not takes them away and decides to grant them on whim, and that they don't want to have this global entity that doesn't care about the individuals and the communities in their own nations. I mean, these things are basic common sense. And I think that the international community, what we talk about, the globalists, they don't want people to wake up to this, and they want to stop it. So I wouldn't put anything past them.
Right. No, I agree with you. I do. Unfortunately, I have to. I mean, just look what they tried to do to Brett Kavanaugh. I mean, that was insane.
And look what's happening now.
Yeah, I know. I know, that's the joke.
Elizabeth Warren, always a hypocrite. She's coming out and says,
there you go, Elizabeth. And I'm from Connecticut, by the way. I'm a fellow New Englander as well. Yeah. So, I know. Be careful what you weaponize. It's always going to end up being used back against you. And that's you just look at what they were willing to do to destroy in order to stop. And, well, I mean, it comes down to exactly what you said, Charles. You had a great distinction. We can disagree. We're all for disagreement. That's fine. It's derangement that we have an issue with.
Exactly. All right, Steve Turley, let my viewers and listeners know where they can read your excellent work, where they can see your excellent YouTube program.
They can go, so if they want to see just the whole panoply of stuff, go to turleytalks.com. It's my last name, T as in Tom, URLEY, talks, like TED Talks, turleytalks.com. And then just all you have to do on YouTube to check out the YouTube channel is just punch in Dr. Steve Turley. It'll take you right to the page.
All right, Steve, listen, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you, Charles.